The Duke arrived as a beggar to meet his future bride, and his horse chose her before he could speak. Autumn arrived on the road to Marlowe Hall not as a season, but as a creditor. It came in the copper and rust of the drying leaves along the western hedgerow, in the low gray light that gave every field the look of something owed, and in the thin wind that pushed against the shutters of the east wing as if to remind the house that its accounts had never been settled. Somewhere beyond the gate a horse was walking slowly up the lane, hoofs striking the packed earth with the patience of a man who intended to be seen last, or perhaps not at all. Marlowe Hall itself sat at the low end of a shallow valley, a house of 3 narrow gables and 1 wide, added 100 years too late to look proud of itself. The stone was the color of wet wool. The chimneys still smoked at that hour, but only 2 of them and only thinly. It was the sort of house where a stranger might knock at the tradesman's entrance without meaning to insult anyone, because the front door had lost the small dignity of being obvious. Inside the kitchen, Miss Rowena Marlowe was already at the small side table by the hearth, a pair of her father's gloves in her lap and a needle held between her teeth. The clock in the passage had not yet struck 7. The rest of the house had not yet stirred. The kettle over the fire made a low, contented sound, and a red-brown cat named Mercy watched her from the flagstones with the still, uninterested attention of an animal that had decided long ago the girl at the table was furniture. Rowena's hair was the color of wheat left in a rain, plaited once down the back and pinned at the nape with 2 brown pins that had belonged to her mother. She was 22. Her eyes were a soft gray. Her hands were long and capable, and there was a small scar on the second knuckle of her right hand from a hot iron 3 winters ago. She wore a plain slate-gray morning dress with long sleeves buttoned neatly at the wrists and a modest collar high at her throat, and over it a mended white apron. Everything about her was in order except that no one in the house had noticed she was in it. She threaded the needle. She drew the leather of the glove taut over her thumb. She began the small, patient stitch her mother had taught her by candlelight when the house had still had a mistress and Rowena had still had someone who called her clever. Her mother had been dead for 11 years. Her father had married again 7 years ago. Her half-sister Diana had been born 4 years ago, and Diana's mother, Lady Marlowe, had introduced into the house a new arithmetic, in which Rowena was neither daughter nor servant, neither guest nor mistress, but a kind of quiet accounting error the household had learned to walk around. She heard, faintly, hoofs stop at the gate. The kitchen boy, Peter, came in from the yard, wet at the shoulders. Mississippi. There is a man at the yard. On foot. His horse followed him in. He is asking for Sir Edmund. His boots are through. He looks, begging your pardon, like a beggar. Rowena set the glove aside. Mercy the cat lifted her head, considered, and lowered it again. Has he given a name? He said his name is Weston, miss. He said he was expected. She was aware, in the second between one heartbeat and the next, of the peculiar cold that comes into a house when it realizes a thing it has half forgotten. Weston. Mr. Weston. She had heard the name at her father's dinner table 3 weeks ago, once spoken with the careful, slightly overheated cheer that Sir Edmund used only when he was speaking of matters he did not wish his wife to interrupt. Mr. Weston, of a distant northern family, of solid property, of an interest in an alliance. Mr. Weston, whose age had not been mentioned. Mr. Weston, whom she had never seen. She had not been told he would come today. Show him into the small parlor, Peter, and warm the small pot. And Peter, do not wake my father yet. The boy nodded and fled. Rowena stood for a moment with one hand on the edge of the table. Outside, the wind pressed against the shutters again, and beyond the shutters, in the yard, a horse she had not yet seen stamped once, and then twice, and then stood quiet as if it had already decided something. She smoothed her apron, remembered she was wearing an apron, untied it, folded it once and laid it across the back of the chair. She did not go to the little glass in the passage to check her hair. She did not pinch her cheeks. She only crossed the flagstones in her soft house shoes, opened the kitchen door onto the yard, and stepped out into the gray October morning to meet the man her father had promised her to, without her father knowing yet that he had come. She was invisible in her own house. She had been invisible for so long that she had stopped noticing the shape of it. On this morning, For the first time in a great many mornings, someone was about to see her before anyone else in the house had troubled to look. The yard at Marlowe Hall was smaller than it looked from the road. A rough square of trampled gravel, one water trough, one leaning apple tree, and the flint wall of the old dairy. The horse stood in the middle of the yard on a loose rein that trailed from no hand at all, because the man beside it had let it fall. He was tall. That was the first thing. Tall and shabbily wrapped in a dark traveling coat that had once been good and was now dulled at the elbows and cuffs, its collar turned up against the wind. His boots, as Peter had said, were through. He wore no hat. His hair was dark, cut plainer than a gentleman's, and there was mud along the line of his jaw. A day's growth of beard shadowed his cheeks. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the horse. And the horse, a great, glossy, black hunter with a white star between its eyes, an animal utterly inconsistent with the state of the man leading it, was, in that moment, walking away from him. The horse walked slowly across the yard, past the water trough, past the leaning apple tree, and came, on hooves that fell as neatly as if they had counted the steps, to stop directly in front of Rowena Marlowe. It lowered its dark head and stood there. Rowena did not move. She lifted one hand, slowly, palm turned up and open, and set it flat against the wide black cheek. The horse pressed into her hand and closed its eyes. Behind the horse, the shabby man made a small sound, half a word, half a laugh, and stopped where he was. She looked past the animal to him then, and their eyes met properly for the first time. His eyes were not the eyes of a beggar. That was the second thing. They were dark, deep-set, tired, and there was something in them she did not have a word for at that hour of the morning. A steadiness, a testing, an attention held very carefully in reserve. He looked at her the way a good horseman looks at a horse he has not been introduced to, and then, having looked, he inclined his head in a way that no beggar in Rowena's experience of beggars had ever inclined a head. Not obsequious, not desperate, not asking. Simply courteous. "Madam," he said. His voice was low. It was carefully worn. It was not a beggar's voice. "Forgive Orion. He does not usually approve of strangers so readily." "He does not appear," Rowena said quietly, still with her hand against the horse's cheek, "to consider me a stranger." Something moved in the man's face at that. A small, contained thing, gone before she could name it. "No," he said. "He does not, I see. You are Mr. Weston." "I am." "You were expected on Thursday next." "I was," he said. "I came earlier than I told your father I would." A pause. Then, quite even, it was, I confess, a piece of impertinence. "I wished to see the house on a day when the house was not expecting me." She looked at his coat. She looked at his boots. She looked at the horse he had somehow acquired for a walk of many miles on those boots. She did not, precisely, understand him. But she recognized, in a way she could not have put into words, that the pretense he was standing inside was a courtesy, not a trap. She lowered her hand from the horse's cheek. She said, "Then you will forgive us, Mr. Weston, if the house is not ready for you. I will have Peter take Orion to the stable, and I will have the small parlor made warm, and I will send to my father at the hour he usually rises, which is at 8, and by then you will have had tea. Would that suit?" "It would," he said, and inclined his head again. "Very much. Have you eaten this morning?" "I have not." "Then you will have that also." She turned and walked back across the yard, aware without looking that he was watching her. She did not, for the first time in a great many mornings, feel invisible. At the kitchen door she paused, laid her hand briefly on the doorpost, and drew in one careful breath. She had understood, from the moment the boy had spoken the name at the kitchen table, that her marriage had walked into the yard on borrowed boots. She had not understood, until the horse had walked toward her, that she was going to be looked at. She opened the kitchen door and stepped inside. The kettle was singing. Mercy the cat had not moved. "Peter," she called quietly, "the small parlor and the good tea. And go to my father's man. Tell Winthrop that Mr. Weston is here. Not yet my father. Only Winthrop." She reached for the apron she had folded, and, on second thought, left it on the chair. Sir Edmund Marlowe came down at 8:30 in his second-best coat, with the composed and slightly disappointed expression of a man who had rehearsed a speech for a Thursday and was now obliged to give it on a Tuesday. He entered the small parlor, saw the shabby traveler at the window with a cup of tea, hesitated for half a second, and bowed with the practiced flexibility of a country baronet whose accounts had been in disorder for some years. "Mr. Weston, you are a little in advance of us. I am Sir Edmund. I hope you will forgive it. Entirely. Entirely." A glance at the tea, at the boots, at the coat, at the calm face above the coat. "My daughter has already made you welcome, I see. Miss Marlowe has been most gracious." At the word daughter, Rowena, standing quietly at the sideboard where she had been arranging the second pot, understood a further thing, that her father had not, in fact, yet learned to say her name aloud in the same breath as Mr. Weston's, and that the omission would be corrected today. "Rowena, my dear," said Sir Edmund with the small, careful cheer that meant he was speaking to her because it would embarrass him not to. "Come? Si. Mr. Weston, my elder, my daughter, Rowena." "Rowena, Mr. Weston." Rowena curtsied. Mr. Weston bowed. "We are acquainted," said Mr. Weston, mildly. "Are you?" Sir Edmund looked briefly relieved, as at a small piece of business already done. Well, then we may come to it, perhaps, more quickly than I had feared." They sat. Rowena poured. She was aware of Mr. Weston's eyes on her hands. She was aware, also, that his eyes were not, in the way she had learned to fear, appraising her in the manner of a man measuring a purchase. They were watching her pour a pot of tea as if the act of pouring a pot of tea told him a great deal, and as if he intended to remember all of it. Sir Edmund cleared his throat. "Mr. Weston, the matter we spoke of by letter, it is my understanding that you have not altered in your kind proposal." "I have not, Sir Edmund. And my daughter is, of course, aware in general terms of the honor of your interest." Rowena had not, in fact, been aware in any specific terms of anything of the sort. She set the pot down very carefully and folded her hands in her lap. "Sir," said Mr. Weston, without looking at Sir Edmund, "if I may." "Yes, please, Miss Marlowe." He turned in his chair, so that his attention was to her, and spoke as if her father were not in the room. "I have come here today, unexpectedly and, as you see, poorly dressed, because I wished to know whether the person to whom I proposed to be married would meet an unpromising stranger in her father's yard with civility. I have my answer, and I am grateful for it. I wish, however, to be very plain. If you say no this morning, I shall get on my horse and go back the way I came, and no matter of contract will follow you into any parlor of England. If you say yes, I shall marry you within the fortnight in the parish church at Grantley, and I shall take you to my estate, which is called Ravenhurst, in the north. I am not a man of many speeches. I have not made you any promises this morning that I do not intend to keep. And I have made you no promise, this morning, about who I am, only about what I will do. Do you understand me?" Sir Edmund made a small, distressed noise. Rowena did not, in that moment, hear him. "I understand you, Mr. Weston," she said quietly. "Then I will ask you," said Mr. Weston, "in your father's parlor, with your father witness, but only for your answer, which I will accept from no one else. Will you marry me?" She looked at him. She looked at the coat with the worn elbows and the dark eyes above it. She thought of her stepmother and of Diana and of the small back bedroom she had slept in for 11 years and of the horse in the yard that had lowered its head into her hand. She said, "I will." Sir Edmund exhaled audibly. Mr. Weston inclined his head, once, gravely, and set his cup down on its saucer with the care of a man who had rehearsed a great many possibilities and had not, until that moment, allowed himself to rest against any of them. "Then, sir," he said to her father, without taking his eyes from her, "with your permission, and with two small conditions of Miss Marlowe's choosing which I invite her to name to me now, in your hearing, and which I will bind by my word, I should be very glad to speak to your solicitor this afternoon." Sir Edmund, unbalanced, agreed. Rowena, unbalanced also, considered. "Two conditions, Mr. Weston." "To Miss Marlowe. First, that my mother's Bible, which is in the small cabinet in the back parlor, goes with me. It was not left to me by name, and my father's household has not yet chosen a place for it. I should like a place for it. It shall have one at Ravenhurst in whatever room you prefer. Second, that no letter of mine to any friend or relative I choose to write to shall ever be opened before it leaves your house. There was a small silence. Sir Edmund reddened faintly. Mr. Weston did not look at him. That, Miss Marlowe, he said, I would have given you without asking. She inclined her head. Then she said, I have said yes, sir. And I will say yes again when the Reverend at Grantley asks me. And I will not, in either instance, ask a further question I have not asked this morning. He looked at her then in a way that would later, when she remembered it, seem to her the first time in her life she had been looked at directly, and he said quietly, Thank you, Miss Marlowe. The horse in the stable, at that moment, whickered once, as if it had been listening. They were married 11 days later, at 10 in the morning, at the parish church of St. Botolph in the village of Grantley, in the presence of Sir Edmund Marlowe, of Lady Marlowe, of Miss Diana Marlowe, who was made to stand still, and who did not, of the Reverend Broxton, of Winthrop the manservant, and of no one else. Mr. Weston came to the church in the same worn traveling coat in which he had first come to the yard. Rowena wore a modest gown of a soft, clean cream muslin trimmed with narrow ivory ribbon, long-sleeved and high-necked, a small ivory shawl about her shoulders against the November cold, and her mother's plain gold ring on the little finger of her right hand, moved for the morning so that it would not be in the way of the ring her husband was about to give her. There were no bells. There was no wedding breakfast worth the name. A cold tongue, a plum cake left over from Michaelmas, and a bottle of Sir Edmund's second-best claret. Lady Marlowe was cordial in the manner of a hostess who has been relieved of a long-standing domestic irritation and does not wish to be reminded of it. Diana, at 4, wanted to know why Rowena was wearing a ribbon and Diana was not. At 12:30, a plain traveling coach, plainer than a man of Mr. Weston's promised property might have been expected to send for his bride, arrived in the yard. The great black hunter Orion, saddled, was tied behind it. Mr. Weston himself rode. Rowena, with a single small trunk containing her plain dresses, her mother's Bible, and a folded piece of ivory-colored muslin her mother had once put by for her, sat inside the coach with a footman named Barnes on the box and a maid named Susan opposite her whom she had never seen before that morning and who had been sent up by Mr. Weston for the purpose of the journey. They traveled 2 days north. Mr. Weston rode alongside the coach on Orion. Each evening he saw her to a private parlor and a locked chamber and Susan in the adjoining room, ate with her at a small table, and asked at what hour she wished to be woken. He did not, in those 2 days, sit closer than the far side of that small table. Rowena lay awake at night and listened to the rain on the tiles and considered that she had married a man about whom she knew almost nothing except that his horse had chosen her, and that he had asked her, in her father's parlor, only for her answer. On the second evening, at supper in the private parlor at the Blue Boar in Hesketh, he set his knife down and said, quietly, Mrs. Weston, tomorrow we shall be at Ravenhurst by dusk. I owe you, before we arrive, a small warning. She waited. The house is old. The east wing is closed. The staff is small. It is not a house at present that expects a mistress. There has not been one for 11 years. 11 years. My mother died when I was 20. My grandmother, the dowager, lives at Ravenhurst still, in the west wing. She will meet you tomorrow evening. She is, you will find her, herself. He almost smiled at that. The other members of the household you will meet in due course, and you will not, I think, find any of them uncivil. But you will find the house cold. I mean that literally. The east wing is not heated. I mean it also, perhaps, in another sense. I ask you not to take that other sense personally, Mrs. Weston. It is a coldness that predates you. I understand, Mr. Weston. Adrian, he said. And then, more quietly as if to himself, or, at least, the name I have given you. She did not, at the time, catch the second half of that sentence, because he had turned to put another log on the parlor fire. Ravenhurst rose out of the November dusk on the second evening exactly as he had described it, old, wide, 3 tall stories of pale stone gone silver in the last light, a portico of 4 columns that had seen better paint, and a long avenue of leafless limes that lay across the coach's approach like the ribs of some enormous animal. There were lights in only 3 windows of the whole facade. The rest were dark. Behind the house, a rook cried once and did not cry again. Mrs. Fell, the housekeeper, met them in the great hall. She was a small, sharp, upright woman of 60 in a black stuff gown and a plain white cap, and she had, Rowena saw, the eyes of a person who had run this house for a very long time on very little help. She curtsied to Mr. Weston, to Adrian, and to Rowena, and she said, "Ma'am, your rooms have been made up. The Dowager begs to be excused this evening and will receive you tomorrow at 11. Thank you, Mrs. Fell. Your dinner, ma'am, is laid in the small dining room. The master takes it at 7. Thank you." The house was cold. He had told her that literally, and it was literally so. There were fires in her bedchamber, in her dressing room, in the small dining room, and in the library at the end of the west corridor. The rest of the house was dark and unheated. The smell of old wood smoke and old damp and old dogs and old wax laid over everything like a soft, unaired sheet. The furniture was good and mostly Georgian. There was silver on the sideboard that had not been polished in a fortnight. There was a portrait over the drawing-room fireplace of a woman in a pale blue gown who was, Rowena understood without being told, Adrian's mother. Dinner was formal. It was served at a long, dark, mahogany table that seated 14, and Adrian sat at the head and Rowena at the foot, and there were 15 feet of polished mahogany and 3 silver candlesticks between them, and neither of them, for the first quarter hour, spoke. The footman moved silently. The clock in the corner struck the quarter. Rowena ate. "Is the fish to your liking, Mrs. Weston?" "It is, sir." "Thank you. You must tell Mrs. Fell what you prefer to eat. She has, I think, been in some doubt about what a lady eats." "I eat what is set before me, sir." "Yes," he said quietly. "I feared as much." The silence resumed. Rowena did not, that evening, feel unkindly treated. She felt, in a way she had never felt at Marlowe Hall, unnoticed by design rather than by neglect, as if this cold, unlit, quiet house had been waiting for her by not preparing for her, and as if the man at the far end of the table had asked her here to see what she would do with 15 feet of mahogany and no obligation to fill it. She looked at the portrait over the fireplace. She looked at her plate. She said very quietly, "The room is beautiful, Mr. Weston. It has only been asleep." He looked up from his plate then, and she caught him looking up, and he was, she saw quite clearly, very tired. Not tired in the way of a man who had ridden 2 days. Tired in the way of a man who had not, in 11 years, expected any part of the house he lived in to be called beautiful in his hearing. "You are kind, Mrs. Weston." "I do not think I am. I think I have only eyes." He set his knife down. "Then you have more than most who have sat at this table." They finished the meal in a silence that had, over the course of 10 minutes, ceased entirely to be the same silence in which they had begun it. When she rose at the end and made him her curtsy and left him to his wine, he stood and remained standing at the head of the table until she had passed through the door and out of his sight. Then he sat down again, alone at the head of the long mahogany table with 3 silver candlesticks between him and the empty chair 15 feet away, and he pressed the heels of his hands very briefly against his closed eyes, and did not, for a full minute, open them. The house at Ravenhurst kept, for the next 3 weeks, the shape of that first dinner. Adrian was not unkind. He was scrupulously courteous. He was not cold, he was precisely careful. He rode out at 8 each morning and came back at 11. He shut himself in the estate office from noon till 3. He dined with her at 7, at the long table, with the 3 silver candlesticks between them. He drank his glass of port alone. He said good night to her in the corridor. He did not knock at her door. Rowena, for her part, watched the house. She watched Mrs. Fell. She watched the 2 housemaids and the elderly footman. She watched the fires that were laid too small and the sideboards that were dusted too seldom and the silver that had not been rubbed. She watched, particularly, that the drawing-room, which faced south and would have been warm even in November if a decent fire had been kept there, was closed and unused, and that the little morning-room off the library, which faced west and would have been dim by 3, was where Mrs. Fell brought her tea alone at 4. She did not, in those 3 weeks, ask a single question about her husband that she could not answer by observation. She did not, in those 3 weeks, ask a single change in the house. She learned. She waited. She began, quietly, in the very small ways she had been taught by her mother, to be seen without asking to be. The first small act of competence was the pantry. Rowena, on the 10th morning at Ravenhurst, took an inventory of the pantry, not because Mrs. Fell had failed, but because Mrs. Fell was 60 and had let the count of the sugar and the tea and the raisins drift in the direction of comfortable estimates. Rowena did not correct her. She sat with her and said, "I make it this. Do you also make it this?" Mrs. Fell, who had spent 11 years being certain that any lady who ever came to Ravenhurst would first make her small in front of the young master, went, over the course of 2 mornings, from stiffly correct to stiffly polite, to, on the 3rd morning, when Rowena said quietly, "Mrs. Fell, I hope you will forgive me for not telling you sooner. My mother, before she died, ran a smaller but not dissimilar house, and she taught me. She thought me clever, though I have never yet had occasion to prove it, that a mistress's first year in a house is properly spent listening. I intend to listen. I would be very grateful if you would go on telling me what I ought to know." Went, on the 3rd morning, quiet, and dabbed her eye once, and said, "Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, I shall." Adrian did not, that first fortnight, know any of this. He knew only that the tea at breakfast was different, and, on the 2nd Wednesday, that the pantry door had been oiled. The second small act was the drawing-room. Rowena did not order that the drawing-room be opened. She asked Mrs. Fell one afternoon whether the chimney had been swept that year. Mrs. Fell said it had been, but that the room had not been used. Rowena said, "It faces south, does it not?" And Mrs. Fell said, "It does, ma'am." Rowena said nothing further that day. On the following morning, before Adrian returned from his ride, she asked, quietly, whether a fire might be lit in the drawing-room for 1 hour, only to air it. Mrs. Fell had a fire lit. Rowena went and sat in the room for a quarter of an hour, on the sofa by the fireplace, with the portrait of Adrian's mother above her, and she took her work-basket, and she began to mend the cuff of one of her own dresses. Mercy, for she had brought Mercy from Marlowe Hall, in a covered basket, and Mercy had accepted Ravenhurst on the 2nd afternoon with the air of a cat who had suspected all her life that she was owed a larger house. Mercy came into the drawing-room, considered the hearthrug, and sat down on it. When Adrian returned from the estate office that day at 3, Mrs. Fell said to him, in the hall, quietly, "The mistress is in the drawing-room, sir. She asked for a fire in it, only to air the room." He stood for a moment with his gloves in his hand. Then he said, "Thank you, Mrs. Fell," and he did not go to the estate office. He went, instead, up the west corridor and stood, unseen, at the drawing-room door for perhaps 20 seconds, and looked at the wife he had married 11 days ago sitting on the sofa in his mother's room, in a plain gray morning dress with long sleeves buttoned neatly at the wrists, mending her own cuff by the fire he had not permitted to be lit for 11 years, and he did not, at that moment, know what expression was on his own face. He did not enter. He turned quietly and went to the library, and he sat there for an hour without opening a book. At dinner that night he asked, at last, "Was the drawing-room warm, Mrs. Weston?" "It was, sir." "It is a pretty room. My mother was very fond of it." She looked up. "Then I shall not sit in it, sir, if it grieves you." "No," he said quickly, quietly. "No. Sit in it, please. She would like it, I think." The 3rd small act was the boy. There was a boy at the stables. Thomas, 12 years old, thin, careful, the son of the village doctor who was too proud to accept the position but not so proud as to refuse the wages, who had, on the 4th morning, fallen down the stable ladder in the presence of Orion and split his lip against the manger. He had not cried, because he was 12 and it was Orion's stall. Rowena, crossing the yard with a basket for the housekeeper, saw him and stopped and set the basket down, and knelt in her plain slate-gray morning dress on the straw beside him, and pressed a clean cloth from the basket to his lip and said, "Do not be afraid. Hold this. Breathe slowly." And she sat with him on the straw for 11 minutes, until his father came from the village. Orion, in his stall, did not stamp. Orion watched. Adrian did not learn of it that day. He learned of it a week later when he asked the boy why he limped, and the boy said, "The mistress, sir. She sat with me on the straw." "On the straw?" "On the straw, sir. She was not afraid of the horse." "No," said Adrian, half to himself. "No, she is not." The 4th small act, the one which did not, at the time, feel to Rowena like an act at all, was the small round table. The long mahogany dining table at Ravenhurst seated 14. There was no need, and had been no need in 11 years, of a table that seated 14. It had been set at every dinner Rowena had eaten in the house because Mrs. Fell had not been told to set another, and there was no other in the small dining room to set. But in the corner of the little morning room off the library, under a dust sheet, there was a small round oak table with a single leaf, of the sort that would seat 2 comfortably and 4 at a squeeze, and Rowena had noticed it on her second morning in the house, and had considered it, and had thought about it, and had said nothing. On the 23rd morning at Ravenhurst, over her tea, she said, "Mrs. Fell, the small round oak table in the morning room under the sheet. Would you be so kind, this afternoon, as to have it moved into the small dining room, and the long table taken back to the great dining room? 2 chairs at the small round table by the fire. That is all." Mrs. Fell said, "Yes, ma'am," and then, after a moment, "Yes, ma'am." That evening at 7, Adrian came down from the estate office, entered the small dining room, and stopped in the doorway. The long mahogany table was gone. The 3 silver candlesticks were gone. In their place, drawn close to the hearth so that the firelight fell on it warm and gold, stood a small round oak table with a single leaf, laid for 2, with 2 of the plainer silver candlesticks lit in its center and a low bowl of the very last November roses from the walled garden between them. 2 chairs faced each other across the table. The fire in the hearth had been built up higher than usual, and the room, for the first time in 11 years, was warm. Rowena, in a plain evening dress of soft dove-gray wool, long-sleeved, high-necked, was already standing at the table with her hand on the back of her chair. She looked at him steadily. "I hope, sir," she said quietly, "that this is not an impertinence." He did not, for a long moment, speak. He came into the room. He crossed to his chair. He set his hand on the back of it, and he stood, and he looked at her, and he said quietly, "Mrs. Weston, it is not." They sat down together, for the first time, at a table across which she could hand him the salt. The small round table changed the house. It did not change it in a way that could be described, at first, to any observer other than Mrs. Fell, who understood entirely. It changed it in ways of degree, which is the only way a house of 11 years' silence can be changed and not break. Adrian, on the morning after that first dinner at the round table, did not go out to ride at 8. He rode at 9. He came in from the estate office at 2 rather than at 3. On the following Tuesday he came in from the estate office at 1, and asked quietly at the library door whether Mrs. Weston might care to walk with him in the walled garden before dinner if the light held, and if it did not tire her. She said, "It will not tire me, sir." They walked. He showed her the espaliered pears his grandfather had planted, and the row of small quince trees his mother had chosen, and the sundial that had stopped in 1789 and had never been reset because his grandmother had preferred it stopped. He did not, that afternoon, touch her arm. He walked half a step behind her, on the gravel, and pointed with his gloved hand when he wished her to look at a thing. She looked at the things he pointed to. She looked also at him. She noticed, that afternoon, 3 small things about him she had not noticed before. That he limped very slightly on the left side, which she had at first taken to be an artifact of his boots and now understood to be a low, permanent thing, a old injury courteously hidden. That his gloves, unlike his coat, were extremely good, and that he did not, when he pointed to a thing, ever quite look at her face. He looked at the thing and waited, and if she said, "I see it," he nodded and moved on. On the second walk, 3 days later, she said, "Mr. Weston, Adrian, I have not asked you a question I might have asked you at Grantley. I do not think, now, I need to ask it, but I should like to know, at least, whether you are well." He stopped on the path. He did not turn immediately. "Well, I do not mean in body. I mean whether the small dining room has grieved you. I would not knowingly grieve you." He turned then and looked at her fully, and she saw again the very tired man she had glimpsed on the first evening at the long table. "Mrs. Weston, Rowena, if I may." "You may. The small dining room has not grieved me. It has done a thing to me I did not know a room could still do." She waited. You have moved a table. I understand it as a movement of a table. I understand it also as a movement of another kind. In 11 years I have not known how to move that other kind of thing. I have not known where to begin. Do you understand me? I think I do. I ask you, he said quietly, to be patient with me. I do not ask anything else of you or for you or from you this month or the next or the month after that that you have not chosen. But I ask you, please, to be patient with me. I know that is a great deal to ask of someone who has been asked already to give a great deal. It is not, she said quietly, a great deal to ask. He inclined his head. He did not, that afternoon, take her hand. He walked her back to the house. In the passage at the drawing-room door he stopped and he said thank you, and he went to the library. The Dowager Duchess of Ravenhurst, Lady Almeria Weston, sent for Rowena the following morning at 11, as she had originally intended and had, one imagines, deferred by 3 weeks in order to see what the young woman would do with a cold house on her own. She was 78. She sat by the fire in her own upstairs sitting room in the West Wing in a gown of very good black bombazine, a fine white lace cap, her hair beneath it entirely white, her eyes exactly the color of Adrian's, and a small, sharp, half-suppressed smile at one corner of her mouth that suggested she was, at 78, largely entertained. "Come in, child. Sit. Yes, there. The chair does not bite. It is only my dog's chair, and my dog is dead. Turn your face to the light. Yes. Yes, I see. Sit down." Rowena sat. "You have moved a table." "Yes, ma'am. He told me." "Yes, ma'am. He did not tell me. Mrs. Fell told me. He told me at breakfast that you had oiled the pantry door, which is a form of telling me. Come, my dear. You are frightened of me. You need not be. I do not bite my grandson's wife." On the first morning of her visit, Rowena, unexpectedly, laughed. It was a small, surprised, careful laugh, of the kind a person makes when they have not laughed properly in a house for 3 weeks. "That is better," said the Dowager. "Now, 2 questions. Then tea. First, how do you find him?" "I find him kind, ma'am." "He is not kind, my dear. He is trying to be kind. There is a difference." "Second, do you know who he is?" There was a small pause. Rowena felt, in that pause, the shape of a thing she had not, in 3 weeks at Ravenhurst, permitted herself to notice. "I know that he is my husband, ma'am." The Dowager looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, quietly and not unkindly, "That will do for today, child. That will do for today." She rang for tea, and for the next 40 minutes, over strong tea and shortbread, in a west-facing sitting room with a fire, she told Rowena a great many things about Adrian's mother, and about the walled garden, and about a housekeeper who had preceded Mrs. Fell and who had been very stupid, and about none of them anything about who Adrian precisely was. Rowena did not, that day, ask. That evening, at the small round table, Adrian did, for the first time, reach across the table and, very lightly, set his hand upon hers where it lay beside her wineglass. He did not hold it. He touched it only for perhaps 3 seconds. Then he took his hand away. She did not move her hand for another minute after he had taken his away, because she was afraid the small round table might notice. "We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel." It was in the 4th week at Ravenhurst that Rowena understood the Dowager was to be, in the specific way an older woman can be to a younger woman when there is no other, an ally. It was not a grand alliance. It happened by degrees. The Dowager sent for her a second time and a third, and by the 2nd week of Rowena's 5th week at Ravenhurst she was expected at 11, in the West Wing sitting room, 3 mornings out of 7, without any letter of invitation being sent. She sat in the dog's chair, which had ceased to be the dog's chair, and she was given very strong tea and shortbread and, on occasion, a small glass of Madeira the Dowager was not officially supposed to be drinking. The Dowager did not speak of Adrian directly. She spoke around him. She told Rowena of a season in London in 1789 in which she had been given a diamond necklace by a man she had refused to marry, and had returned the necklace by the following Tuesday. She told Rowena of a housemaid she had dismissed 40 years ago for kindness. For kindness, mind you, my dear, not for cruelty, and Rowena understood, obliquely, that she was being told something about kindness in bad houses, and about the price the Dowager, in her time, had paid to keep her own intact. The Dowager also spoke of Ravenhurst. Not the estate, the house. She told Rowena the names of the rooms Rowena had not yet been in. She told her which chimneys smoked when the wind was in the east and which floorboards on the 2nd landing squeaked. She told her that the portrait over the drawing-room mantel was Adrian's mother, whose name had been Cecilia, and that Cecilia had once, at 28, laughed so hard at a supper party that a bishop had spilled his soup, and that Adrian had inherited exactly one half of that laugh and had, for 11 years, used none of it. She did not, in speaking of Cecilia, cry. She only, once, at the end of a story, laid her old, veined hand flat over Rowena's on the table, and left it there for a moment, and took it away. "I am a great many things, child," she said on a Thursday in early December, "but I am not blind. I have not been blind since 1793, and I do not intend to become blind now. I ask you nothing. Do you hear me? I ask you nothing. I only tell you what I see. I see him beginning to eat his dinner. I see him laughing at Mrs. Fell's joke about the raisins, which is not a good joke, and I have been listening to it for 20 years. I see him wearing his good coat on a Wednesday. Do you understand me?"
Ido, ma'am.
"Good. Now, second thing." The old lady set her cup down. She fixed Rowena with the very Weston eyes. "The season begins in 6 weeks. You will be expected in London. He has a house there. He will hate it. You will not. I ask you. I am fond of you now, my dear, and it is a great inconvenience to me to be fond of anyone at this stage of my life. I ask you not to let London do to him what London can do to a man who has been alone in a cold house for 11 years.
Mum?
There will be people," said the dowager, "who will have opinions about you. There will be a young woman in particular. I shall not tell you her name because I do not wish to give her the compliment of a warning, who will have taken his marriage badly. She will show her teeth to you. She will show them beautifully, and by candlelight, and in silks. Do not, my dear, on any account, show her yours in return. Do you understand me? I do not have teeth of that kind, ma'am." The dowager laughed, once, sharply. "No, my dear. That is precisely why I am telling you." Rowena, that afternoon, walked back through the long west corridor to her own rooms, and she stood for some minutes at her window, looking out over the walled garden, and she felt, for the first time since she had left Marlowe Hall, that a piece of the world had been placed under her feet. She did not, in that moment, know its full name. She only knew that there was a woman upstairs, in a black bombazine gown, who intended for her to survive whatever London was. Adrian, that evening, at the round table, said quietly, "My grandmother has been keeping you." "She has, sir. She is very kind." "She is not kind," he said, half smiling for the first time she had seen. "She is trying to be kind. There is a difference." She looked at him across the small round oak table with the 2 candles between them, and she smiled quite openly, for the first time in Ravenhurst, and she said, "Sir Adrian, I think I have been told that already." He did not, that night, reach across the table for her hand. He did not need to. She did not, that night, sleep. She did not sleep because she had understood, in the walk back from the west corridor, a piece of information that had been sitting quietly in her at Ravenhurst since the 3rd morning and that she had not yet asked herself. The Dowager Duchess had not, in 6 visits, once called herself Mrs. Weston. She had called herself twice. Once in relating a story of her own, the Duchess. She had said of her late husband, "He was the Duke, my dear," and it did not agree with him. She had said of the walled garden, "It has always been the garden of the Duchess of Ravenhurst." She had spoken of the house not as a country property but as an estate that answered to a title. She had said of Cecilia, Adrian's mother, "She was Duchess for 13 years, and I never once corrected her about the roses." The Dowager Duchess of Ravenhurst, which meant her grandson was. Rowena sat up in bed. The fire in her bedroom had settled to embers. Mercy the cat was asleep at her feet. She got up. She wrapped a shawl of soft, modest, plain cream wool over her long-sleeved white nightgown, and she walked, in her stockinged feet, down the west corridor to the top of the great staircase, and she stood there for a moment in the darkness, listening. Somewhere below, in the library, she could hear it as a thin line of light under a distant door. Adrian was still awake. She did not go down. She stood at the top of the stairs for a full minute and thought about it. Then she walked back to her room and she sat down at the little writing desk by the fire, and she took a sheet of paper and a pen, and she began to write a letter. Not to him, but to herself, as her mother had taught her to do at 8 years old when a thing was too large to be thought about aloud. She wrote in her small, careful hand, "I have married a man who calls himself Mr. Weston. His grandmother calls herself the Duchess of Ravenhurst. His horse is worth more than my father's stable. His gloves are extremely good. His coat is very bad. He has not lied to me. He has not told me. There is a difference between these two things, and I owe him still my patience about which of the two he intends. She sealed the letter unopened in an envelope, and she put it in the drawer of her writing desk, and she went to bed. She did not, in the morning, break the seal. She had told him, once, that she would not ask a further question she had not asked at Grantley. She had meant it then. She meant it still. Whatever he was, she had, in the small dining room at Ravenhurst, watched him half become, the shape of a man who was, at last, in his own house. She did not intend to force the rest of it before he had chosen to give it. They travelled south in the first week of January. The London house of Ravenhurst was a tall, narrow, well-proportioned townhouse on the north side of Grosvenor Square, with a black door, a lion's head knocker, and a footman in dark green livery whom Rowena had not previously seen and who addressed her, when she stepped from the coach into the January dusk, as Your Grace. She did not, for perhaps a full second, understand him. Then she did understand him. She did not turn to look at Adrian. She only inclined her head with the small, careful grace of a woman who had lately been schooled in the arithmetic of a great house, and she said, "Thank you," and she went in. Adrian, in the entrance hall, watching his wife hang her plain grey travelling cloak on a hook a footman was ready to take, saw the second in which she had understood, and the second in which she had chosen not to require it of him. He said, quietly, at her shoulder, "Not here." "No, sir. Tomorrow. In the morning. Before we go anywhere. I owe you the whole of it." "Yes." He inclined his head, and he went upstairs to change, and Rowena stood alone for perhaps 10 seconds in the hall of a London house that turned out to belong to a duke, and she understood, with the calm that had carried her through 11 years at Marlowe Hall and 3 months at Ravenhurst, that a piece of the world she had suspected since the dowager's sitting-room had, at last, taken its true shape. He came to her in the morning, at 9, in the little back sitting-room that faced a courtyard rather than the square. He came in his good coat. She had begun to understand at Ravenhurst that he had a good coat and had chosen not to wear it, and he shut the door behind him and he did not sit down. "Mrs. Weston." "Rowena."
Iam Adrian Weston."
"That is my name. I have not lied to you. What I have not told you is that I am also, and have been for 6 years, the Duke of Ravenhurst. My father died 6 years ago. My mother 11. I am the only son. The title is mine. Ravenhurst is mine. This house is mine. The staff at Grosvenor Square call me Your Grace because I am. When I came to Marlowe Hall in October, I came without my title because I had watched 6 years ago 2 young women be introduced to me at a supper party at which my title was announced first, and I had watched both of them look at the title. I did not wish, when I met you, for you to look at the title. I wished to know whether a woman would be civil in her father's yard to a stranger who looked as though he had walked 20 miles. She waited. "I know," he said more quietly, "that this is not a thing that can be undone by explanation. I know that I owed you the whole of it at Grantley and did not give you the whole of it at Grantley. I know that my grandmother, in her way, gave you half of it in November and left me the other half. I have been a coward on this point for 3 months. I am asking you, will you forgive me?" She looked at him. She did not, for a long moment, speak. Then she said very quietly, "Adrian, my mother taught me when I was 9 that a man may be silent about a thing for 2 reasons. Because he intends to keep it hidden, or because he does not yet know how to name it. I have believed since October that you were silent for the second reason. If I have been wrong, tell me now, and I shall know how to answer you. If I have been right, then, sir, there is nothing to forgive because you have not lied. You have not been wrong. Then, Adrian, there is nothing to forgive." He did not, in that moment, reach for her. He crossed the small sitting room and stood in front of her and looked at her, at the pale wheat-colored hair, at the soft gray eyes, at the modest morning dress of pale rose-gray with long sleeves and a plain white collar high at her throat, and he said, "You have been very generous with me, Rowena. I do not know when I will next be able to say to you a word of that size. I say it now. Yes." There was a small silence. "There is one thing more." "Yes." "You are, from this morning, the Duchess of Ravenhurst." My grandmother, who ought properly to have been called the Dowager since I inherited, is officially the Dowager Duchess of Ravenhurst. There is a season to be got through. There are calls. There is a court dress. There is a young woman, an acquaintance from an earlier year who will not be kind to you. My grandmother has warned you of her, I think. She has. She will be, particularly at Lady Halstead's ball on the 12th. Then I shall go to Lady Halstead's ball on the 12th. Rowena, Adrian. I have been, she said quietly, invisible for 11 years in a house where nobody in particular was trying to make me invisible. I do not intend to make a great deal of noise now, but I do intend, if I am to be the Duchess of Ravenhurst, to be seen by anyone who looks at me directly, and no more than that. I ask you only to walk beside me and not to be ashamed of me. He stood in front of her for a further moment. Then he did, at last, take her hand. Not the touch of the small round table, but a full holding of the hand, and he lifted it, and pressed it once against his forehead and set it down. I shall not, he said quietly, be ashamed of you. They went, that afternoon, to be seen. They rode in the park at 4. They dined at the Halstead house on the 7th. They attended a private concert of Italian song on the 8th. Rowena wore, on all 3 occasions, modest, high-necked, long-sleeved gowns of soft, unshowy colors, cream, dove-gray, a very deep, quiet plum, with only her mother's small gold cross at her throat, and a plain circlet of pearls Adrian had given her the morning after the concert without ceremony and with only the words, "They were my mother's. They will suit you," and Rowena had said, "Thank you," and had put them on. She was noticed. She was, on the 2nd afternoon, mentioned in a letter by Lady Halstead to her sister-in-law as the new Ravenhurst. A quiet creature, not showy, but of unmistakable dignity. I own I had expected less of Weston's choice. She was, on the 3rd evening at the concert, watched across the room twice, by a young woman in a striking gown of deep rose-red silk with a diamond aigrette in her chestnut hair, whom Rowena, having never seen her, understood in the second glance to be Miss Cordelia Ashfield. Miss Ashfield smiled at Rowena, over the head of the man to whom Miss Ashfield was speaking, with a smile of very finely calibrated warmth. Rowena inclined her head, once, courteously, and did not smile back. She had been warned. She was not, in the dowager's phrase, going to show her teeth in return. She was going to walk beside her husband, and she was not going to be showy, and she was not, at Lady Halstead's ball on the 12th, going to be ashamed of herself. It began 3 days later at the Fitzhugh musical evening. A very quiet, very small assault, delivered by Miss Ashfield in passing to Lady Halstead, in the exact carrying tone of a woman who knew, precisely, where the sound of her voice would land. Poor Weston. He has taken a wife the color of the wallpaper. One almost wonders whether he chose her for that. Rowena, 3 feet behind Miss Ashfield's left elbow, heard it clearly. She did not turn. She did not color. She said quietly to Lady Halstead, whose eye she had caught, "Is that the Reynolds above the mantel? I have not seen it since I was a child." Lady Halstead, unbalanced by the accuracy of the recovery, said, "It is," and Rowena said, "It is very fine," and Miss Ashfield's remark, for want of a target, dropped into the space between the 2 women and was gone. But it was unmistakably the beginning, and Rowena, that evening, walking back to the coach on Adrian's arm, understood that Miss Ashfield had begun, in the mildest and most easily denied way, to test the ground, and that she would, if not answered, keep testing. She did not, that night, tell Adrian what Miss Ashfield had said. She had understood, at Ravenhurst, 3 things about her husband, one of which was that a fight defended on his behalf, before it had come to a fight, would grieve him more than the fight itself. She let it stand. She waited. She was a woman who had, for 11 years at Marlowe Hall, understood how to wait. Miss Cordelia Ashfield was 21, the second daughter of a good Sussex family, and had, from the age of 18, considered the Duke of Ravenhurst her private, quiet, entirely uncommunicated understanding. An understanding formed on a walk in the garden at Ashfield in the summer of the year before Adrian's father had died, in which the Duke, then still Lord Adrian, had lent her his coat against a sudden shower and had, in the shelter of a rose arbor, told her, without any hint of gallantry, that her opinion of a certain novel was the first correct opinion of that novel he had heard from anyone at that party. He had not said anything else. He had gone back to Ravenhurst 2 days later, and his father had died 4 months after that, and he had shut himself in the north for 6 years. She had, in those 6 years, said no to 2 barons and a marquis's second son, because she was waiting for the man who had, in a rose arbor, told her her opinion was correct. She had heard of his marriage in October at Ashfield, over the toast at breakfast. She had gone very white and had not eaten the toast. She had come down at luncheon in a new gown and told her mother she intended to spend the season in London. She was, at the Fitzhugh musical evening, not stupid. She had understood, in a glance across the room at Rowena in her cream gown, that the new Duchess of Ravenhurst was not a woman who would be undone by a single carrying remark. She revised, in the coach home, the shape of her campaign. She would not be crude. She would be gradual. Her first act, at Lady Marchmont's rout on the 16th, was to arrive on the arm of Adrian's own second cousin, Mr. James Weston Fane, whom she had worked on very carefully in the intervening 10 days. She stood with him in the anteroom and spoke of Ravenhurst, of the estate, of the tenants, of a matter of drainage on the Northfield Adrian was known to be considering, in the exact, slightly proprietary tone of a woman who had grown up hearing these particulars at her father's table. Rowena, passing, heard 3 sentences of it. She kept walking. She did not, that night, mention it to Adrian. Her second act, at a small dinner at Lady Templeford's on the 22nd, was to speak, at a moment when Rowena was seated 3 chairs to her left, of a country party she had attended at Ravenhurst 4 summers before, in a way that assumed familiarity with the arrangement of the library and the wallpaper of the second guest bedroom, both of which particulars she had in fact learned from Mr. James Weston Fane. Rowena, at the table, understood that she was being publicly informed that she was not the first woman to have sat in the library at Ravenhurst, and that she was expected to color at the information. She did not color. She said, quietly, to her left-hand neighbor, "The library at Ravenhurst is a very handsome room. My husband's mother chose the wallpaper. It has, my grandmother-in-law tells me, been the same for 32 years. Lady Templeford, at the head of the table, gave her a slow, appreciative look. Miss Ashfield, 3 chairs to Rowena's right, did not, for the rest of the fish course, speak. Adrian, that night in the coach home, took her hand. You are being, he said quietly, very brave. I am being, she said, very quiet. There is a difference. There is. Adrian, is Miss Ashfield an acquaintance, a childhood acquaintance, nothing else? I have not, at any time, given her cause to believe otherwise. I did not think that you had. But she believes it. Yes. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, Rowena, I am sorry. You have no cause to be sorry. I have every cause. If she troubles you further, she will, said Rowena calmly. She will trouble me further. I am asking you, Adrian, please, not to answer her before I have answered her. She is not shouting yet. When she shouts, I shall need you, not before. He looked at her, in the dim light of the coach lamp, for a long moment. Then he said, very well, Duchess. It was, she realized later, the first time he had called her that. He had not, until that moment, used the title. Miss Ashfield's third act came on the 2nd day of February, at the private view of an exhibition of watercolors at the Somerset House Rooms, and it was, this time, not deniable. Rowena, standing before a watercolor of a country churchyard, felt a shoulder brush hers, and a low voice said at her ear, I do wonder, Duchess, whether he tells you your opinions are correct. He told me once, in the rose arbor at Ashfield, that my opinion of Mansfield Park was the first correct opinion he had heard in a week. I have understood since. Rowena did not turn. She looked at the watercolor. She said, quietly, Miss Ashfield, if my husband had, in a rose arbor, told you your opinion was correct, and had, for months later, gone into 6 years of mourning without asking your father a single question, then I believe he had already told you, without asking your father, what he thought of the matter. I am sorry. I am truly sorry, if you understood him otherwise. But I am not the person to whom you ought properly to be speaking of it. She turned then, and she looked at Miss Cordelia Ashfield full in the face, at the beautiful pale skin and the wide, dark blue eyes and the pain and the pride at the corner of the mouth, and she said, still very quietly, Miss Ashfield, I have not made you an enemy. I do not intend to. I ask you, one woman to another, please not to make one of me. Miss Ashfield's eyes filled once, briefly, with a hard, bright, angry water. And then she stepped back. And then she smiled, with the finely calibrated warmth of the concert, and she said, "Duchess, you misunderstand me entirely. I meant only to congratulate you on your husband's taste in wife." And she walked, on her small satin slippers, to the far end of the room. Rowena, standing before the watercolor, took one full, careful breath. Adrian, at her elbow, said, "Rowena, what did she—" "Nothing that will not keep, my love." She had never called him my love before. It had come out. She did not, in that moment, decide it. She had said it. She stood by it. Nothing that will not keep. He did not press her. But Miss Ashfield had understood, in that watercolor room, that Rowena would not be moved by anything less than a forgery. And, over the next 10 days, in a small, methodical, very quiet way, she began to arrange one. She had a housemaid at her mother's Grosvenor Street house who had, before the Ashfields, been employed at Ravenhurst under the previous housekeeper, a cruel woman, dismissed 6 years before. That housemaid still had, in a small tin box in the attic, a single letter, quite genuine, written by the dismissed housekeeper to a cousin, complaining of the young master and of sums she believed unaccounted for by the estate agent. A letter of no importance whatever, since the sums had in fact been accounted for. But the letter existed. It bore the Ravenhurst seal. And Miss Ashfield, in a quiet interview with the housemaid, obtained it, paid for it, and took it to a friend of her cousin's who had, on 2 occasions, done a very small piece of forgery of the type gentlemen sometimes required. By the 2nd week of February, at some cost, Miss Ashfield had, in her possession, a document. It was not, precisely, the original letter. With 2 paragraphs added in a hand consistent with the housekeeper's, it appeared to accuse the young Lord Adrian Weston of having, in the month of his father's death, turned a widowed tenant off the Ravenhurst home farm to pay a private debt. The accusation was false, and disprovable by any 5 minutes' consultation of the Ravenhurst estate books. But it did not need to be true. It only needed to be produced in the right room on the right night, before enough people had had enough wine that the disproof would not, publicly, be permitted to catch up with the accusation. Lady Halstead's ball was on the 12th of February. Miss Cordelia Ashfield had been invited. Miss Cordelia Ashfield intended to go. Lady Halstead's ball was the fixed point of the season's 2nd month. 300 guests, for musicians of the first rank, a supper in the yellow drawing-room at midnight, and a ballroom of pale ivory and gold that had been laid out expressly, that year, in honor of a young Austrian ambassador's wife. Everyone of any importance was invited. Everyone of any importance came. The Duke and Duchess of Ravenhurst arrived at 10. Adrian, in a dark blue coat cut severely and correctly, unshowy, of a superb tailor, gave Rowena his arm at the door of the coach. Rowena, in a gown that was neither cream nor rose nor plum but the exact, quietest, deepest shade of a leaf green that had grown in the shadow of a wall. A gown of long sleeves buttoned neatly at the wrists, a modest, high, straight neckline that traced her collarbone but did not fall below it, no train, no ornament except the plain circlet of pearls that had been his mother's and a very narrow ribbon of the same green in her wheat-colored hair, took his arm and stepped down. The dowager, watching from the window of her sedan chair, said, half to herself, half to Mrs. Fell, who was not there to hear her, "That is exactly right, child. Exactly right. Not a woman in this room will know why they cannot look at her. I know why. I know why." Miss Ashfield, in her rose-red silk, and with the forged letter in a small silk pocket at her waist, saw them come in. She had positioned herself near the entrance to the yellow drawing-room where supper would later be. Rowena danced twice with Adrian, once with Lord Denbigh, once with an Austrian gentleman of the ambassador's party. She was throughout watched. The ambassador's wife herself took her arm for 2 minutes on the balcony and said, in French, "You are the calmest woman in this room. It is very refreshing." The dowager was not there. The dowager was 78 and Ravenhurst was 300 miles away, and Ravenhurst had, at 78, decided a great many years ago that London ballrooms after 10 o'clock were not for her. But the dowager had, before Rowena had left Grosvenor Square that evening, sent down, by Mrs. Fell's hand, a small folded note. Rowena had opened it in the coach. It had contained one line, in the dowager's very sharp, upright hand. My dear, when she shows her teeth, look at her, and remember that you have, at Ravenhurst, moved a table. Rowena had understood. At midnight, in the yellow drawing-room, where the tables of supper had been laid and 140 guests had come in to sit down and the orchestra had ceased and the room was full of that chandelier-lit, wine-warmed, watchful attention unique to a great ball at the moment between the last dance and the first mouthful. Miss Cordelia Ashfield, standing near the room's center with her forged letter in her hand, raised her clear, carrying voice, and said, "Your Grace, Duke, forgive me. I do not, in general, permit myself to speak on such matters. But there is a piece of paper here, a letter, I ought properly to call it, which, out of concern for your good name and out of a duty a childhood friend owes a childhood friend, I feel I ought publicly to present. I should not," she said, and her voice went on the word, from clear to soft, "wish it to be said of me that I had let a thing lie." She held up the folded letter. Every face in the yellow drawing-room turned. Adrian, standing beside Rowena, went, at that instant, the exact color of a man to whom a thing has been done in public, on a night when he is required publicly to bear it. He did not move. Rowena, with her hand on his arm, felt the small, deep, tight muscle of his forearm go still under her fingers. Miss Ashfield read the letter aloud. The 2 paragraphs, the forged ones. She read with clear, careful, almost pained emphasis. She read the accusation. She read that the young Lord Adrian Weston had, in the month of his father's death, quietly turned a widowed tenant off the Ravenhurst home farm to sell the land, and that the sum had been paid to a private London debt. She said, at the end, I do not wish this to be true. I bring it forward only because it is, I am told, in the housekeeper's hand, sealed with the Ravenhurst seal, and I could not, in conscience, hold it. The yellow drawing-room did not, for a long, half-suspended second, breathe. Adrian opened his mouth to speak. Rowena's hand tightened once, quite precisely on his arm, the smallest possible pressure. He did not, then, speak. Rowena stepped, very slightly, in front of him. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The yellow drawing-room, having stopped breathing, was going to hear whoever spoke next, whatever their volume. "Miss Ashfield," she said quietly, "may I see the letter, please?" Miss Ashfield, for the smallest half-breath, hesitated. Then she said, "Of course, Duchess," and she handed Rowena the letter, and Rowena took it, and did not, at first, look at the writing. She looked at Miss Ashfield. She looked at her for perhaps 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds she saw Miss Ashfield's pupils dilate, Miss Ashfield's color rise very slightly along the collarbone, Miss Ashfield's right hand close once on the fold of her rose-red silk, and Rowena, who had at 11 watched her father lie to her mother about the disposition of her mother's Bible, and who had, at 14, watched her stepmother lie to a housekeeper about the count of the raisins, and who had, at 19, watched Sir Edmund lie to a solicitor about the interest. On a small note of hand, understood, with the calm and certain observational instinct her mother had trained into her, that the letter in her hand was not what Miss Ashfield had said it was. She lowered her eyes to the paper. She read the first genuine paragraph, the old dismissed housekeeper's complaint of a chill in the servants' hall. She read the second paragraph, the forged one. She read the date. She read the seal. She said, quite quietly, in a voice pitched to reach every table in the yellow drawing-room without at any point rising, "Miss Ashfield, this letter contains, in its second paragraph, a very serious charge. I have not, until this moment, seen it. I ask you, therefore, one very small question, so that the truth of the matter may be established in this room tonight and not left in doubt. The letter alleges that my husband, in the month of his father's death, turned a widowed tenant off the Ravenhurst home farm to sell the land. I ask you, the name of the widowed tenant." Miss Ashfield, who had prepared for many things, had not prepared for that. I do not. I did not, Duchess, memorize. The letter is in your hand. You have just read it aloud. The name of the widowed tenant is not, I think, mentioned. I have read the letter also. There is no name. The housekeeper does not use the month of the sale then. The letter says only the month of his father's death, which is the month of April, 6 years ago. My husband's father, the late Duke of Ravenhurst, is buried at Grantley. There is a stone. His death is a matter of parish record. I ask you, on what date in April 6 years ago is this sale said to have taken place? Miss Ashfield, whose forger had not consulted the parish register, said nothing. Miss Ashfield. The letter also names in its first paragraph its genuine paragraph, I take it, a chill in the servants' hall at Ravenhurst, and refers to it as being in December. December of 6 years ago. But the second paragraph, the accusing paragraph, refers to a sale in April of 6 years ago, which is 4 months earlier. The letter is not consistent with itself. If the housekeeper wrote the second paragraph, she wrote it 4 months before she wrote the first, and yet, in the letter, they are joined together as if written in one sitting. Miss Ashfield. It is not in the housekeeper's hand throughout. There was a very small, very definite intake of breath from Lady Templeford at the second nearest table. Rowena turned the letter, held it once toward the great chandelier so that the paper caught the light. The ink of the second paragraph, she said quietly, is a darker black. It has not been laid on the same day. Miss Ashfield. Who wrote the second paragraph? Miss Cordelia Ashfield's face went, in a way that no arrangement of powder in this world could have prevented, entirely white. She did not answer. Miss Ashfield, said Rowena, and now her voice was, for the first time in 11 years at Marlowe Hall and 3 months at Ravenhurst and 6 weeks in London, not soft, only clear and steady and heard. I do not require you to answer me here. I require you only to permit me to keep this letter in my possession, and to permit me to send it, in the morning, to my husband's solicitor, who will consult the parish register at Grantley, and the Ravenhurst estate books, and will send, if I ask him to, a very polite gentleman to Ashfield in Sussex to ask your father certain questions. I have no doubt what he will find. I have no doubt what you already know he will find. I ask you, therefore, one thing more. In front of the room to which you have addressed a very serious charge, I ask you to say only, that the second paragraph is not in the housekeeper's hand. The yellow drawing-room did not, at that moment, quite dare to breathe. Miss Cordelia Ashfield, at 21, of a good Sussex family, stood in the center of the yellow drawing-room at Lady Halstead's ball and looked at the woman in the leaf-green gown who had, in 2 minutes, unmade her. And there was, in her wide, dark blue eyes, a great deal, humiliation and rage, and a very old, private, aching disappointment, and, as Rowena had understood at the watercolor room, a real and human hurt at the loss of a rose arbor that had never been anything to anyone but Miss Ashfield herself. And Rowena, who had said at the watercolor room, I do not intend to make an enemy of you, did not, in that moment, drive her. Miss Ashfield, she said more softly, if you say it now, I shall be silent about the rest. Miss Cordelia Ashfield closed her eyes for 1 full second. Then she opened them and said, at a volume that carried to Lady Templeford's table and no further, the second paragraph is not in the housekeeper's hand. Rowena inclined her head. She folded the letter once and put it into the small silk pocket at her own waist. She turned then, at last, to Adrian, who had not, in the whole of those 4 minutes, spoken or moved, and she said quietly, so that he could hear her and only he, my love, if you will. And he, Adrian Weston, the Duke of Ravenhurst, who had ridden into a country yard in October in a borrowed coat to see whether a woman would be civil to a stranger, and who had, in 4 minutes, watched his wife defend him at Lady Halstead's ball in a way he would not have thought to defend himself, took her hand in his own in front of the yellow drawing-room and turned to face the room and spoke. He spoke, at first, evenly. He said what needed to be said. He said that the charge was false, that the estate books at Ravenhurst were open to any solicitor who wished to see them, that the seal on the letter was genuine and the second paragraph was not, and that the matter would be pursued in the ordinary and lawful manner in the morning. Lady Halstead, at the head of her own supper, nodded once, decisively. The room, which had not permitted itself to breathe, breathed. And then, in the small, half-suspended second after the practical matter had been laid to rest, before the orchestra could be signaled to strike up again, Adrian did not quite let the moment pass. He did not let go of Rowena's hand. He turned very slightly, so that he was speaking not to Lady Templeford's table, not to Miss Ashfield, not even quite to the room but to his wife. I have listened, he said quietly, to my wife tonight. I have listened to her a great deal in the last 4 months. And I have understood, in the last 4 minutes, a thing I have understood in fragments before and have not, until now, said aloud. And since I have been given, tonight, in a room I did not choose, the opportunity to say it, I shall say it now in the same room so that no one who is present tonight can afterwards say that I did not. The room went still. I did not, said Adrian, choose her for her fortune, because she had none. I did not choose her for her beauty, though she has it, and it is not the beauty a room of this kind is trained to notice. I did not choose her for her family's name, which is old but not great, or for her family's connections, which she has none of. I did not choose her because I had known her since childhood, because I had not. I did not choose her because I had been advised by anyone whose opinion I trust, because I had been advised by no one. I did not choose her because she was, when I met her, the mistress of a great house, because she was not. I chose her. I chose her, because on a gray October morning in her father's yard, she came out of her father's kitchen in a plain gray dress and a mended apron to meet a stranger she thought was a beggar, and she was civil to him, and she was not afraid of his horse, and she did not, until she saw him, look at his coat. I chose her because she saw a man before she saw his boots. I chose her because she was seen by my horse before she was seen by me, and my horse, on that point, has never in his life been wrong. I chose her because she moved a table in a house that had not moved a table in 11 years and did not ask my permission to move it, because she did not need my permission and because I did not know I had wanted the table moved until she moved it. I chose her, tonight, in this room, over again, and I will choose her tomorrow, and I will choose her every morning that I have the choice until I do not. He turned, then, to look at her fully. Duchess, my Rowena, you were seen, tonight, by every person in this room. You were seen, even when you thought you were invisible. And you will not, on any morning that I have the ordering of it, be invisible again. The yellow drawing room, at that, forgot itself and, from a small table in the far corner, someone began, entirely against ballroom decorum, to clap. And then, at the next table, another person. And then, at last, at every table, and the sound of it, in that particular chandelier-lit half-second, was not the sound of a scandal being diffused. It was the sound of a room recognizing, all at once, a thing it had been unable, until the words were spoken, to see. Miss Cordelia Ashfield left the ball, quietly, at 1:10, in her mother's coach, and did not return to London that season, and was, 3 months later, married to a very kind gentleman in Sussex who did not, at any point in his own courtship, mention a rose arbor. They did not stay at Lady Halstead's for supper. Adrian gave their apologies to Lady Halstead, who was, by that point in the evening, entirely on Rowena's side and pressed her cheek once against Rowena's own and said, "My dear, I have never been happier to lose a supper guest in my life. Go home, go home." Rowena kissed her back, briefly, and they went out to the coach. In the coach Adrian did not, at first, speak. He sat opposite her rather than beside her, an old habit, for perhaps 2 minutes. Then he came on the 3rd minute and moved across and sat beside her and did not, for perhaps another minute, take her hand. When at last he did take her hand, he took it in both of his, and held it flat between his 2 palms as if he were warming it, and rested his forehead, once, against the back of her fingers. "Rowena, my love, Adrian, I did not know," he said quietly into her hand, "that I was going to say those things in that room. I said them because I could not, once you had looked at me over her shoulder, not say them. I hope that I have not, I hope that they were not too public. They were exactly public enough." He looked up at her then. She saw, in the small light of the coach lamp, that his eyes were wet, quite openly, without shame, and that he was, for the first time in the 4 months she had known him, entirely undefended in her presence. "Rowena, yes, I love you." She looked at him for a moment. Then she lifted her free hand, and set it very lightly against his cheek, and she said quietly, "I know. I have known, I think, since the small round table. But it is very nice to be told." He turned his face into her hand and, with his eyes closed, kissed the inside of her palm. Once, quietly, without any ceremony at all, and did not, then, move. They rode home through the January going into February streets of London in the silence of a coach in which nothing further needed, at any point, to be said. In Grosvenor Square, at the black door with the lion's head knocker, he handed her down. In the hall, the footman took her cloak. Adrian said quietly to the footman, "Bring us tea in the library, and then leave us until morning." The footman said, "Yes, your grace." In the library, at the small round side table by the fire, for Rowena had, on their second evening at Grosvenor Square, quietly asked Mrs. Fell, who had come south with them, whether a small round side table might be found for the library fire, and Mrs. Fell had found one. Adrian sat down opposite her, and he took her hand across the small round table, and he said quietly, I ought properly to have asked you this on the second evening at Ravenhurst. I did not have the courage. I am asking you now. Yes. May I come to you tonight?" She looked at him across the small round table with the two teacups between them. She had never, at Ravenhurst, at Grosvenor Square, at Marlowe Hall, been asked that question by anyone. She had been asked it that night, gently, with the whole of her husband's tired courtesy, in a house that belonged to her also. She said, "You may." He rose, and he did not, at first, come to her side of the small round table. He walked around to her, and he stood in front of her, and he offered her his hand, and she took it and stood up, and he did not kiss her in the library. He held her, for a moment, against the front of his dark blue coat, and she felt the tired, quiet, 4 months restrained weight of him rest for a moment against the top of her head. Then he stepped back and offered her his arm and walked her, without any speech at all, up the great staircase and to her door. At her door he stopped. He said quietly, "Rowena, I love you. In a quarter of an hour, if you will let me, I will." He inclined his head, and he went quietly along the corridor to his own dressing room, and she went in. We do not, in this house, tell what is not for telling. Rowena's mother had taught her, in the small back parlor at Marlowe Hall when she was 9 years old, that a happy woman's happiest hours are those which are hers alone, and that a novel which describes them is a novel which does not, in fact, understand them. What we may say only is that Adrian Weston, the Duke of Ravenhurst, came to his wife's door a quarter of an hour after leaving her at it, in his own dressing gown, with his hair still damp, and she opened the door to him, and he stayed, and he did not, until sunrise, leave the room, and that Rowena Weston, the Duchess of Ravenhurst, did not, in the following morning or any morning after it, sleep alone in her London bed again, while her husband slept in his own dressing room down the corridor. That much may be told. The rest we leave to them. In the morning at 9, she came down to the small back sitting room in her simplest morning dress of pale lavender wool, long-sleeved, high-necked, her hair down her back in a single plait. He was already at the small round table. He had already ordered the tea. He stood up when she came in, and he did not smile. He looked at her with the steady, tired, entirely unshuttered expression of a man in whose face there was, at last, no reserve at all. "Duchess." "Adrian." He came to her, and he kissed her once, quite properly, on the forehead, and he took her hand, and he sat her at the small round table opposite him. Mercy the cat, who had come south to London in a covered basket and had accepted Grosvenor Square with a degree of tolerance, walked in, considered them, and lay down between their feet on the hearthrug. He said quietly, "I have sent the letter to my solicitor. He will see the parish register today. He will speak to the housekeeper who wrote the first paragraph, who is still, I believe, in London with a sister. Miss Ashfield will not, I think, trouble us further. If she does, my solicitor will speak to her father." "Adrian." "Yes. I do not, I think, wish to press her father. I asked her last night, one woman to another. She answered me, 'That is enough.'" He looked at her across the small round table for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Yes. Very well, Duchess. That is enough." He picked up her hand from the table, and he turned it over, and he kissed once, quietly, the inside of her wrist where the plain gold ring on her little finger, her mother's ring, caught the morning light. "Come," he said, "let us go home. To Ravenhurst? To Ravenhurst. The season will hold without us. My grandmother is waiting." Yes. They finished the season, in fact, over the following 10 days, for a duchess does not simply leave, but they left at the end of February together, and they went north. It was on a morning in September, a year and 7 months after Adrian had ridden into the yard at Marlowe Hall on a good horse and bad boots, that Rowena, the Duchess of Ravenhurst, came down the shallow, worn stone steps of the south terrace at Ravenhurst with a shawl of soft cream wool over her shoulders and stood, for a moment, at the top of the walled garden path, and watched her husband walking toward her along it. He was in his shirt-sleeves. It was warm, the last true warmth of a long summer, the light on the espaliered pear's yellow gold as beaten metal, and he had been down at the home farm at 7 with the estate agent, and he was carrying a small folded cotton square, which was, she had understood at the small round table 3 months ago, the way Adrian indicated he had brought her a wildflower. He came up the path. He handed her the folded square. It contained, she opened it, a single, small, deep blue cornflower. For you. Thank you, my love. He kissed her briefly, and he took her hand, and they walked together. She in her long-sleeved morning dress of pale primrose muslin, he in his shirt-sleeves with the linen turned back to the elbow. Up the path, past the sundial that had stopped in 1789 and had, now, on Rowena's quiet suggestion of the previous April, been reset by a clockmaker from York and was, at that moment, telling the correct time for the first time in 31 years. The dowager on the south terrace in her wheeled chair. She had, at 79, finally consented to the chair, and had immediately begun to enjoy it, watched them come and did not, for once, say anything. They went in to breakfast in the small dining room, at the small round oak table with the single leaf, drawn up close to the window rather than the hearth, because the mornings were warm. Mrs. Fell still at Ravenhurst, still at 61, though there was talk of her niece coming to help her, brought the tea. The plain silver candlesticks were not lit, because it was September. In a low bowl in the center of the table were 3 small, pale roses from the walled garden, cut that morning by young Thomas, whose lip had, by then, entirely healed and who was, at 14, being sent by Adrian to a school in York for the Michaelmas term at Adrian's expense, and who had come up to the terrace 2 evenings before to say to Rowena, in his careful, thin, 12-year-old voice grown broken with 14, Duchess, "Thank you. I shall write to you every Sunday from the school. My father says I must." She had said, "I shall write back, Thomas. Every Sunday." Sir Edmund Marlowe had died in the June of that year, quietly at Marlowe Hall of a chill on his chest, and Lady Marlowe had, with a decorum entirely to her credit, written a stiff but not unkind letter to Rowena asking whether Rowena would receive Diana, now nearly 5, at Ravenhurst for a fortnight in August. Rowena had received Diana. Diana had ridden on a very old, very safe pony, and had, on the 3rd day, formed an unshakable friendship with Mercy the cat, and had gone home, for days later than intended, at her stepmother's request, entirely converted to the belief that her elder half-sister was the most interesting person in England. Rowena had written back to Lady Marlowe a note of very careful, very civil warmth, and Lady Marlowe, who was not a good woman but was, in her way, a fair one, had answered it in kind. Miss Cordelia Ashfield, Mrs. Cordelia somebody else now, had, they heard, in the 2nd week of that August, been safely delivered of her first child, a girl, at her husband's small comfortable estate in Sussex. And Rowena had, at Adrian's suggestion and with his approval, sent a small silver rattle and a very short, very civil note of congratulation. There had been no answer. Rowena had not expected one. Adrian had said quietly over the small round table, when the little parcel was sealed, "That is generous of you, my love." Rowena had said, "It is not generous. It is only quiet. I have told you before, Adrian. There is a difference." Mr. James Westonfane had, in shame, gone to India in the March following Lady Halstead's ball, and was writing, every 3 months, careful and repentant letters to his cousin Adrian, which Adrian answered. The dowager, that September at 79, remained mainly in her wheeled chair. She had begun, in the June, to tire more easily, and Rowena, without any consultation of anyone, had quietly moved her own morning room down to the west wing so that she could sit with the dowager for 2 hours each afternoon and read to her from Miss Austen's novels, which the dowager had, at 18, dismissed as light fiction unworthy of a woman with a copy of Milton, and had, at 79, in Rowena's reading voice, discovered to be entirely on her side after all. That woman was clever, my dear. She was, ma'am. She saw, said the dowager one afternoon, with her eyes closed, who the good women were, and she wrote them a book. And I have, my dear, at 79, been given the wisdom to be read that book by a good woman. I have been very fortunate. You have, ma'am. The dowager opened one eye. So have you, child. I know, ma'am. Rowena, over breakfast at the small round oak table on a September morning that had turned entirely gold, set her hand on Adrian's across the table. Adrian, still in his shirt sleeves, set his other hand over hers. Mercy the cat, 13 years old now, grayer at the muzzle, walked in, considered the two clasped hands on the table, and settled at their feet. There was, on the mantel of the small dining room, a plain gilt frame containing Rowena had ordered it, that spring at a modest London framer, and had hung it herself. A folded square of clean cotton that had, once, on a September morning 18 months before, contained a single small deep blue cornflower. The cornflower itself had been pressed, and mounted, in a second frame in the drawing room. The cotton square, unaccompanied, hung in its own frame in the small dining room as the housemaids did not, in general, understand it, though Mrs. Fell did, as a very quiet, very private, very deliberate remembrance of a morning at Marlowe Hall on which a great black hunter named Orion had walked, of his own accord, across a small rough gravel yard, and had lowered his head into the hand of a young woman in a plain slate-grey morning dress and a mended white apron who had come out of a kitchen to be civil to a beggar. Adrian, at the small round table, followed his wife's gaze to the frame on the mantel. He said quietly, Orion is 21 this year. He will not, I think, see many more. No, my love. I have been thinking this summer of a foal from him, out of that little bay mare of my grandmother's. If you will. Yes. She smiled at him across the small round table. And a black colt. And you will name him Cornflower. He laughed, quite properly. For the first time she had heard him laugh in the small dining room. It was, as the Dowager had promised her a year and 7 months before, exactly one half of Cecilia Weston's laugh, and he had, at last, remembered how to use it. Very well, Duchess. Cornflower. The Dowager Duchess of Ravenhurst, Lady Almeria Weston, in the wheeled chair on the south terrace, listening through the open window because she had, at 79, deliberately arranged her chair for the purpose, permitted herself a small, dry, satisfied smile. There, she said, to a Mercy who was not there, and to a Cecilia who had been dead for 12 years, and to a rose arbor at Ashfield in 1817 that had never, in fact, meant anything, and to a small round oak table she had never quite believed she would see her grandson use. There. You were seen, child. You were seen. Even when you thought you were invisible. And that Rowena, at the small round table, holding her husband's hand in the September light, would have said, had she known she was being narrated at all, was exactly and always and only what it had ever been about. Next, in a snow-choked Northumberland manor on the eve of a wedding no one has been told about, a governess will discover that her employer's silent son has been writing her letters for a year, and that the man about to marry the neighboring heiress downstairs is not the man he believes himself to be. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.